Hi, so today is the 30th of April 2022. And so I've been doing the updates in regards to my journal blog, the Ornery PSA, and a few other aspects regarding my official YouTube channel, as well as where I can in regards of my social media, here and there, mainly posting regarding my website, www.susanmealing.com. And so in reference to what this lecture is about, what is the definition of feminist compared to feminazi? There are certain capacities where there are certain similarities and yet differences. So, in this lecture, a feminist is a female or male who actually believes in the rights of females. That's the starting point. A feminazi believes in the rights of only certain females. That's the difference. So a feminazi doesn't care about other females because they only believe in the rights of certain females, whereas a feminist actually cares about equality. So a feminist, a true, genuine feminist, believes that there is an equality between the biological genders regarding the intellectual capacity as well as the acknowledgement of what situations are capable at the same standards as to the minimum requirements for whichever gender. So in regards of a biological female, if a biological female believes that she can handle certain things regarding the factors of what is considered a normal aspect for a male biological profession, she has to uphold and maintain the minimum standards that would be required for a male. Same thing, vice versa, in regards to biological males in the reference of being capable to maintain and sustain what a biological female in those professions of. And so a feminist would be a female, mostly, who would not lift other females up. That is a part of. However, an actual feminist would actually pay attention to details and lead by example. A feminazi would complain about that. A feminazi would not want to actually have a female, other than certain types, to lead by example. So a feminazi wouldn't want a genuine feminist unless it was convenient for them, because that's what a feminazi is. A feminist doesn't care whether or not it's convenient. A genuinely truthful feminist doesn't pay attention. Not that they don't pay attention, they just don't care about what the societal norms are in regards of those factors, whereas a feminazi would. A feminazi would only want things done in their way, and only for certain time frames, and only in certain capacities, because a feminazi doesn't understand that they are conditioned by the male biological stereotype. They are conditioned, those feminazis are conditioned by the biological male stereotypical norm. A feminazi would go and take the level of trying to align themselves in different factors that they didn't have in their pattern of behavior or their past up until a certain point, because a feminazi would only see it in a way that would benefit them, in comparison to a feminist who would actually pay attention with the patterns of behavior and the actual background of the past to back it up. A feminazi would not care about that until it was actually pointed out to them, and then the initial reaction would be, oh my, what did I do? But then at the exact same time would be upset because they'd realize that they had been a feminazi the whole time. And then a feminazi would try to go and say, well, look at what I did here, and look at what I did here, and look at what I did here, but not pay attention to the actual length of time. Where a feminist, a genuinely truthful feminist, would be capable to say, well, yeah, here and there's a few in the background of, but they wouldn't be as adamant unless they had to. So a feminazi would only do it if they were called out. A feminist would, well, there's certain situations, so let me clarify. Let me make sure already of, just this length of the history of is just to a level that, how do I actually count? Does it really matter of actually counting? Whereas a feminazi would have to actually count. A feminazi probably wouldn't even be capable in a larger capacity to actually list off more than 15 for a 10-year period. Where a feminist would be capable to not only give the examples of, but the patterns of behavior as well, because a feminist in truthful format would be capable to have the length of pattern of behavior. And a true, genuine feminist would not belittle the biological male gender, whether they're LGBTQP or a breeder, for those who understand that. And while there are some breeders that are male and female biologically in the LGBTQP, they know what I mean in those references. In comparison to a feminazi who would actually want that clarification as to what the difference of a breeder would be, which is very simple: a heterosexual. It's very simple. A heterosexual that has no flavor, or what is supposed to be considered the adult consenting lifestyle, as a vanilla. A vanilla is what would be considered as a breeder, but only a vanilla that was not LGBTQP. Because a vanilla that is LGBTQP is different than an LGBTQP in what is considered the adult consenting lifestyle. Because, and those who actually have, especially the old guard in those particular references, they don't need that particular explanation. It's more along the millennial type, where the millennial type think that they know, and then they get edumacated, usually by the old guard, and only when the old guard has to actually be brought out. Because when the old guard comes out, they don't actually want to do it, because they've already come out before. They've already dealt with the stereotypical situations. An old guard individual, whether in reference to what is supposed to be considered the adult consenting lifestyle, or the old guard in reference to the LGBTQP, So they don't usually want to deal with the millennial types because the millennial types go and, oh, well, you're old. Or that's how that is, and that was back then, and you don't know the difference, you don't know this, you don't know that, where the old guard is, well, there's this situation that was here in this time frame, and there's this situation that's here in this time frame. And the difference between the old guard and the millennial types, especially when it comes to the LGBTQP, is they've already dealt with it. They've already gone through it when it comes to the breeder situation. They've already dealt with it when it comes to the societal aspects. They've already been there, done that, went and lived their lives, and just want to live their lives. In comparison to those millennial types, that they want the clout. They want to be seen, they want to be heard, and a lot of old guard really don't care. They don't necessarily not want to be seen and not want to be heard. That's not it at all. It's more along the lines of they just don't care. It's not that they don't care about the larger aspects, it's that you millennial types in this hypothetical go and have to do that one-upping, that clout, that this is this and this is that. And the old guard, whether adult consenting lifestyle and or LGBTQP old guard, they don't mind discussing it, but they don't really want to do it in the millennial way. They want to do it in their way because the millennial way is about clout. The millennial way is, look over here, look what we did this, and da-da-da-da, look, clout! Whereas the old guard, well, yeah, this was this. Yeah, that was that. Yeah, during this time, this is how it went. And millennials are so used to all the flashing and all the different advertisements and all this stuff, and pay attention, click here, do this there, oh, well, look at this. Whereas the old guard is the old guard. And so the old guard is like, yeah, well, sure, you can have all the whatever. And then the millennials are like, well, you're such a fuddy-duddy. Why aren't you doing it this way? Don't you see what's cool? You're not cool if you don't do it this way, which the old guard is that what I was like when I first came out? Did I do this? Did I actually do that to that level? Because that's what the old guard will do. Whether it's the supposed to be consenting adult lifestyle regarding BDSM and swingers, and or the LGBTQP, where the old guard is like, okay, so I remember back in the day, okay, so I went here and I did this, and I went here and I did this. I didn't do that to that level, although at the time frame of, there was this and there was that, but it's not to that level, thankfully, because wow. I'm so glad there wasn't the digital cameras. So glad there, because do you remember when we went here? Do you remember that? They won't ever know that. And so in regards of the difference between a feminist and a feminazi, in reference of the civil rights movement, now let's get into that time frame. Because what I read, and I don't know what others read, but also in reference to having known people that were actually a part of that. So in reference to the civil rights movement, got my grandmama and my grandpapa. I got quite a few of my grandmama and my grandpapa's friends and family. So 1980s, 1990s, the civil rights movement was in the mid-1960s into the 1970s at the same time of the women's rights movement. So I also have, ironically, I have my biological mother, one of her sisters, which the irony of ironies, we didn't really get along. Probably because of the irony of us being so damn similar, just in a different capacity. Because where she was a part of the civil rights movement, and especially the women's rights movement, in conjunction to the LGBTQP rights movement, which is not really known about as much, but also in regards of the supposed to be consenting adult lifestyle movements. You know, they were known, but they weren't known. Only if you went to certain types of concerts, or only if you went to certain events, and it was as it was. And we really did not get along. When I was younger, we did not at all get along whatsoever, because more so along the lines of that you did hippie stuff, more along because of the military. That was my issue. Now, because I stood up for the military, that's for those who know back then, because of all of the propaganda that was going on in reference to Hollywood. Where Hollywood was, well, look at what's going on, and here's this, and here's that. Well, yeah, that's truthful, but you gotta show both sides. You can't expect people to have a genuine opinion that would be truthful if you don't give both sides. If you don't show that, or at the very minimum, acknowledge that there is another side. So I'll give this as a reference. When listening to CNN, very few times did I ever hear Fox News brought up. I heard MSNBC brought up. I heard the AP brought up. I heard the New York Times brought up. LA Times, Chicago Times, or Chicago Tribune, so on and so forth. On Fox News, or Fox Business News, I heard CNN brought up, I heard MSNBC brought up, I heard the Chicago Tribune brought up, I heard the New York Times brought up, I heard the Washington Post brought up, I heard the LA Times brought up. I heard a lot of different news outlets brought up. And so at the very minimum, Fox News, in more, not saying I didn't hear it on CNN or MSNBC, it just wasn't as prevalently brought up, unless, well, you know, that whatever, and I'm gonna give you my opinion now, sort of situation. And so that's kind of why I like listening to more than one particular viewpoint, because I get to cipher between the middle. That's a thing that I do. And so in regards of, when you take in consideration my biological mother, for those who have met, my biological father, for those who have met, and then my biological sister in that product of the two of them, and the comparison. So I'm gonna let you know this actually happened, but I also can only speak the truth. So one day I learned we're gonna go see Grandma Gavitt. And Grandma Gavitt, at that time in the 1990s, she's gonna graduate seminary college. And I learned this, so I was in an art class at the time, a specialty art class, not just in school. So I painted her a swan. It was a fairly large piece. It was actually, if I remember correctly, it was from here to about here, as far as size, and probably equal distance in regards to this part to this part, as far as that particular canvas size. And the swan is swimming on the water. of a lake. And so it's an irony. So I thought that that would be something different in comparison. And, it's one of those, well, this is really cool, look. And so my art teacher, Miss Dottie, she had her opinions as far as certain things, and it was as it was because I was allergic to oil paint, so I had to have an air filter nearby because no matter where in the other areas of the group, they were using oil, no matter what. And I actually had a allergic reaction to that. And, individuals complained because, well, what's the difference? What's important? What's this? What's that? So on and so forth. Well, if you actually care about life, you're not going to have that problem. So went up to Grandma Gavitt's graduation ceremony, and Chris and Edie were there. I think Yvonne was there. My biological mother's eldest brother, though younger than her, from Grandpa and Grandma Gavitt, his first wife, if I remember correctly, and their children, and I think that's who it was. And then the children, as far as that's concerned. So I get sent to go with Chris's daughter. And we go walking on the train tracks because Chris's daughter met a guy at the seminary college. And so I don't really want to go. I don't want to have anything to do with it because I could tell. It was one of those, I don't really think I should. I have this sensation I'll be like a third wheel sort of thing for what they're looking at in comparison. And my Aunt Chris at the time, she's like, no, you don't know what you're talking about. Except I don't understand why you, and I called her out on this, and mind you, I'm in elementary school at the time, I don't understand why you wouldn't see that. I don't understand how you don't realize that particular factor. No. Go ahead. Fine. Well, her daughter is however many years older than I am. I think she was in high school at the time. And my cousins, the other ones, as far as Leonard and Yvonne, they're upset because I get to go hang out with a high schooler and I didn't want to. And they tried saying, well, you're just rubbing it in. And it's like, no, I really don't want to. You don't know. You really don't understand. And so then those two females, Elizabeth and Sarah, if I remember correctly, they stir up a bunch of drama with my biological sister Patricia, and oh, well, we want to go too. And then of course Megan's like, no, Susan's cool. Yeah, cool, awesome. I still don't want to go. I don't want to see that. I don't want to be near that, and so like I'm not really. I mean, I go hang out at other colleges just because this is a seminary college. I mean, I could make a joke about that, but I don't think it's really a joke, and yet it is at the exact same time. And so I've spent some time at Rutgers and Princeton and Brown and Penn State and Harvard and a few other locations. I really think that the seminary school might just be an overall at this point in time regarding all those colleges, but that's just a joke. just because of the word. And so my cousin, Megan, goes, well, what type of joke would that be? Well, I'm fairly certain, literally, the word is in there, pun intended, and oh, you've got such a dry sense of humor. Well, I don't really think so, mainly because of the reference to, because that's not really, well, I mean, it can, however, I don't really, whatever. My biological father says, well, what type of a joke is that? Haven't been in Greco-Roman Latin yet. So you are a biological male. And my biological father says, yeah, what does that have to do with your joke that no one understands? I do not feel comfortable explaining this to you. I have this weird feeling, or I should say weird sensation, that, okay, so I'm your biological daughter, correct? And he's like, yeah. And Patricia is your other biological daughter, correct? And he says, yeah. So I don't understand why I need to explain that to you at all. I don't know. I don't know. I'm fairly certain that's self-explanatory, literally. If you need another example, so my cousins. And he's like, yes. And I said, so there's Elizabeth. And he said, uh-huh. And there's Sarah. And he goes, uh-huh. And then there's Esau. And he goes, uh-huh. I go, I don't understand how you don't see this. Literally and figuratively and metaphorically, all, pun intended, in one. And he looks at me and says, you are speaking in riddles. No, no, I don't think so. I just don't know how you don't see this. Literally. It just is what it is. You know what? I can give you another example of the seminary version, and my biological father says, okay, go ahead. So this is Grandma Gavitt's graduation? And he said, yes. Who are you married to? And my biological father says, her daughter. Mm-hmm. Okay. So then, who's over there? And he goes, that's Edie. And I said, okay, that's another daughter of Grandma Gavitt's. And he said, yes. And so, okay. And then she has two. And he's like, uh-huh. I don't understand how you literally don't literally see this. But okay. Fine. So then, fast forward through all of the situation I'll tell you about in a minute to when Megan and I get back, and then on the way to the van, my biological father says, you know what, I just realized you need to get your mind out of the gutter. What are you talking about? And so he goes over, however many hours before, and I'm like, uh-huh, so you think I should get my mind out of the gutter, yet you have spent how many hours thinking about that? Huh. I don't know. That was like that for me, and I haven't been thinking about that since then. However, you're such a smart ass. Well, it's better to be a smart ass than a dumbass. And I got away with that one. I survived that one. I didn't have any issues, surprisingly. And so, I'll just leave that alone. Anyway, so in regards of, there's my cousin Megan, which is Chris's daughter, which is my biological mother's sister. And we go with this college male, and I'm literally like this. Oh, this is gonna suck. I shouldn't say that. This situation, and so I'm thinking this, and then Megan asks me, what are you thinking, Susan? I'm like, this situation is gonna suck. And she was like, great. I'm just gonna go walk ahead. Pun intended, I guess. I don't want to see that. I'm gonna keep going because I don't need to see this. So they talk, and there was, Susan, why don't you keep on walking ahead of us? Yeah, I was gonna. That's fine. And so I get about 3/4 of a mile down these train tracks. And then I hear, footsteps running. I turn around. Oh, hey, you're done. Awesome. Okay. And Megan's like, oh, I don't need to know. I understand that Grandma's graduating seminary college. Apparently, you graduated in a different way, so that's fine. And she's like, wait, what? I'm like, nothing. Just gonna leave it at the fact you were on train tracks, and whatever. To each their own. I'm gonna keep on walking. What does that have to do with anything? You're older than me? By how many years? I don't need to know. I shouldn't even know this. I am in elementary school. So, the male pulls out, and I don't mean that, he pulls out a bag from his pocket. She goes, oh, that's great. And I was like, is that what you said before? And she looked at me and she goes, what does that mean? Nothing, that's what, we're just at a seminary college. I'm just gonna and she goes and says, oh, you don't know, whatever. It's like, yeah, I just happened to walk about 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile, and I'm not going there. I'm just not dealing with it. So they complain as far as how far I had walked off, and it's like, because I didn't need to see that or hear that or whatever, it is what it is. I pointed this out before. And so there was, a different fragrance to this bag that was not cigarettes. And so there was some green stuff in this bag, for those who would have an idea, okay? These little green leaves are wrapped up. And I look over and I'm like, what's that? And they're like, oh, it's some party stuff. And it's like, yeah, that's, some, and whatever. Yeah, again, I was born and raised in New Jersey. So quick little fast forward to, back in New Jersey in that whatever year, the 1990s, through to Illinois and the state of Texas, my biological mother, I think it was the year of around 2007 or 2008, talking with my biological father about something. She goes outside, or maybe, no, I think it was it was 2008 or 2009, my bad. And so my biological mother goes outside and she says, oh, you're talking about the marijuana. The what? What did you just say? What came out of your face? And she goes, you're talking about the marijuana. Okay. Wow. Okay. Okay, go ahead. I don't have words. I'm literally just stuttering like, whoa. And so now I'm about to have even more of the moment. And she says, I want you to know, Susan, about that marijuana. Okay, let's go. No, that's fine. Let's hear what you gotta say on this. After years ago, this seminary college situation, let's go. And she says, I want you to know. Okay, remember, I'm not asking any of this. And she goes, yes, I know, but you must know. My biological mother had the nerve to tell me that she needed me to know, not having been asked, nothing, okay? Just because my biological father and I were talking about, we were talking about other stuff, fine, whatever. And she says, because we were talking about college and education and certain things. And Anna goes and says, you need to know that I went to Rutgers University in New Jersey and I didn't ever smell that marijuana. Hold on. Hold on. And so Mike rolls his eyes and is like, oh, well, that's a tell. It's a huge tell. Okay. Coming from the male who said something about don't use soap in something. I don't know, and something about wowie or something another. Okay, so let me understand this correctly. You're married to my biological father. Let me start off with that. Okay, so you're married to my biological father, and you went to college in what years? She goes, oh, it's in the late 1960s into the 1970s. Uh-huh. So in the late 1960s, 1970s, you, and then before I can finish, she goes and says, I didn't ever see it, I didn't ever smell it, I didn't ever know anybody who ever used it ever. You need to know that. Why are you laughing? I've met Chris. And Mike is sitting in front of me at this moment. Okay, no. And so, anybody been in the state of New Jersey as far as this particular lecture, in the specifics of, and if you didn't, because maybe you were born later, maybe you knew someone who was around the time of the late 1960s into the 1970s in the state of New Jersey. Maybe maybe somebody could tell, go ahead and leave a comment in the, section of my official YouTube video, with etiquette and respect. Let me know how many people actually had been in the state of New Jersey in the 1960s and 1970s who could clarify, because I told Anna right to her face, I don't believe you. I had issues before. Now that solidifies it. I officially cannot ever believe a word that comes out of your mouth, because whatever she goes and has the nerve to say, no, there's no one I ever met in my entire life. I want you to know, no one in my entire life. You have a sister named Chris. And Anna says, no. She didn't ever. I call bullshit. There are no cards on the table, but I call bullshit. She goes and tries to say, no. Chris was just as perfect as me. Mind you, I remember seminary college. Really? Pun intended. Really? Just as perfect as you. I believe you're a bit delusional. So you went to college? And she said, yes, I did. I went to Rutgers University. Okay, so let me add that one to the comment section of my official YouTube video. Go do that with respect and etiquette, please. Although I don't think you have to be from Rutgers. Maybe you went to a college at another campus, and that somehow, it was just the 1960s into the 1970s. Who had any knowledge of that at all? Just saying. And then again, there's my biological father sitting there, and I remember from my childhood him talking about not using soap to cut powder. Okay, maybe in the defense of, that's not marijuana as she says it. There hypothetically could be something along these lines. I don't mean the train track lines, though maybe, I don't know. So she had continued on and on about how she did not ever know anybody. There was no one in the entire Rutgers campus. Said it like, let me clarify. This is how she said this, okay? There is no one. Not one. Not one person in the entire campus of Rutgers. We are a very serious type. We are very serious about her. Hold on. Which I did laugh at when she did that, and she was like, what is so funny? We are serious about our education. Why are you laughing? Oh. God. We are very serious about our education at Rutgers University. Oh. So there wasn't any, no one in any college. No, go ahead. No. throughout the entire state of New Jersey in the entire time that I went to college ever had any of that marijuana. I don't believe you. I don't believe that there wasn't one person, just one. And so she was trying to tell me that if I knew anything, if I actually had any intelligence, that I should believe her. To this day, the 30th of April, 2022, I still don't believe there wasn't one person in the entire state of New Jersey in the late 1960s into the 1970s who did not ever smoke, as she worded it, the marijuana. You know, I'm just saying, I could be incorrect. However, going back to the seminary college, however you choose to pay attention to that now, I guess pun intended, huh? And so, you know, my cousin, Megan, and this male from who was attending this seminary college. Okay. So seminary college has this, but Rutgers University didn't, according to her. Oh, okay, go ahead. So anyway, Megan asks me, how much do you think a dime bag costs? I don't even know what a dime bag is at that point in time. So I think it's a coin purse. I don't mean that type, get your minds out of the gutter. Or out of the train tracks, whatever, pun intended. And so she, meaning my cousin Megan, she's like, you know, how much do you think a dime bag costs? Well, I didn't pay attention, so I'm thinking, you know, I've been to different stores and I've actually found bags that were on clearance for 10 cents. So I say, 10 cents. She starts laughing. What's so funny? What? Haven't you ever been to cost cutters? I mean, seriously, like, come on now. And so she goes and tries to claim that, you know, what is it? It's something like $30 or something like that for a dime bag, which, what is a dime bag? If it's not what I'm thinking of. If it's not a little coin purse, again, you know, at the seminary college. So she goes on and they do this smoking stuff. So, you know, fast forward to like 2008, 2009. Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. All of a sudden it was a brand new thing, and I'm just saying. Just throwing that out there. So, Chris and I, you know, we didn't not get along then, but we didn't get along then. It was like, well, fast forward to 2012, and I'm dealing with everything I am dealing with up to that point in time. What's going on with my daughter, my son, and I. The after effects of my head injury on Palm Sunday in 2000. And her daughter is up in Canada going to college for art. I didn't even know at that point in time you could go to college for art. It didn't really register with me. Like, in 2012, there was one of those, so it was one thing to know that there are universities that have art classes where you can actually, so they have colleges that do, what type of scam are they running? I did this in elementary school. What is wrong with these people? Seriously. So, it was as it was. So the two sisters regarding my biological mother. Edie and Chris are there with my grandma Gavin. And Chris goes and says, I wonder what type of karma you would be dealing with in reference to what's going on with your daughter. We were in the kitchen. I have so much self-control. I am so proud of myself for having so much self-control. I have so much self-control because anybody who's been in that kitchen knows why I have self-control. Yes. And I was standing by the knife drawer. For clarification, not just the knife blocks, the knife drawer. Like, all I had to do was this, and like I'd have had a whole slew of knives, for those who know that particular, like, seriously. And you know, my scuba diving, I'm pretty proficient. I tend to hit my mark if I have to, and fairly easily. And so this whole situation in regards of it, it's like, what is your problem? This sort of whatever. And so it went on from there. I go outside to I go to the garage. Mike is hiding from the house full of them. And he's like, you look angry. Cigarette. That's all I could say. Cigarette. And he's just, okay, don't you have your own? I need a no filter. And he's just, what? And he's just, oh, you might be upset. yeah, no joke. No joke at all. Infuriated. Done, as far as that was concerned. Infuriated. So, dealing with all that. So a feminist wouldn't ever do something in that capacity of. A feminazi would. Because a feminazi would stir up needless drama for a feminist. Because a feminazi who is bitter in regards of whatever factors, that she literally started working for, the irony of ironies, the man. She actually worked in a prison system doing optical stuff. She worked for the man. Had you know, the yuppie version of whatever. She actually went and did that. It's like, having still had the issues with what it was back when it was. And it's like, yeah, well, you know what? Maybe, just maybe, if you weren't realizing how hypocritical you are, you wouldn't have these problems. Was as it was, I had no patience. So I knew about certain things regarding my biological mother and biological father's wedding, how she had stumbled in around like 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the morning, was upset because she got all drunk and did that sort of stuff, and was as it was. And I didn't have patience for it. And so, you know, then there's the fact that she went to optometry school. Obviously, it's how you're an optometrist. And so there were all these other factors in reference of stuff that I didn't need to deal with. So a feminist wouldn't purposefully, whether in regards of a biological relative or any other female, cause a needless drama. Because a feminist would lead by example. A feminazi would too. A feminazi would lead by the example of how they'd only take care of certain types of females, whereas a feminist would take care of all types of females. A feminazi would only choose certain time frames to ever think it was considered important. A feminist wouldn't care what time it was. A feminazi would have issues with a feminist who wouldn't pay attention or care about the wishful thoughts because of wishing that other things were different before taking that step forward. Whereas a feminist wouldn't care about the feminazi's timeline. A feminist wouldn't care about the feminazi at all for being a feminazi, though would still lead by example as to that factor. Because a feminist wouldn't just think about the current time frame, but also the future, whereas a feminazi would only think in the shortest term possible. A feminist who, whether biological female or biological males that actually believe that females have rights, because a feminazi wouldn't. A feminazi would only believe that certain types of females have rights. And they'd only fit in the categories of if they, checked certain boxes. In comparison to a feminist who wouldn't pay attention to whatever boxes, because realistically a feminist recognizes the fact that you already have one. Whereas a feminazi would be offended by that. A feminist wouldn't care as to what words were used, whereas a feminazi would. Because if it doesn't fit a certain narrative, the feminazi has a problem with it. A feminist doesn't care about a narrative. A feminist cares about reality. A feminist cares about humanity. A feminist doesn't put others down needlessly, though will point out facts, whereas a feminazi will go and stir up needless drama, whereas a feminist will only point out the facts, and if needed, will give the opinion, or the emotional content, or the biases, where a feminazi will give the biases like that and not even realize that they outed themselves as being a feminazi. Whereas a feminist, it'll be wondered one way or another, until when they're ready, they acknowledge they've always been a feminist, but only because of the amount of aspects. Because why would you have to label that? Only feminazis need to label certain things that way. A feminazi doesn't care about the biological male gender, because all a feminazi cares about is the progression of certain females that fit certain sections of certain boxes, whereas a feminist is about actual equality. So if a biological female earns her way, she not only earns her own way, but she shows through leading by example, not in a competitive way the way feminazis do, in the way of actual progression. A feminazi would want to slow down a feminist because they wouldn't ever think for themselves because of how much they have a male that's a sexist, chauvinist pig around them, pulling their strings, telling them their opinion, because a feminazi wouldn't have the comprehension to even pick up on it to begin with. Because the irony of ironies, a feminazi would need a male to constantly be there, whereas a feminist can be a lone ranger and be comfortable. To a degree, a feminist, if a relationship comes along that's worth my time, in comparison to a feminazi where they have that, misery loves company sort of thing. A feminist, comfortable with who I am. Sure, I prefer certain things, but I'd rather lift others up, not by doing it myself by lifting them up, but I can give acknowledgments here and there, and in whatever capacity up. Whereas a feminazi would only see negativity. That even when pointing out facts, even when pointing out the differences and biases, a feminazi would not ever have the capacity to think for themselves because they'd have so much chauvinistic influence in their lives that they wouldn't pay attention to what was hidden in plain sight. Whereas a feminist wouldn't care about whether or not a male or female was around, would still be themselves. A genuinely true feminist will truthfully explain the differences between the actual facts while acknowledging, if required, the biases, opinions, emotional factors because a genuinely true feminist would pay attention to the actual details that were of genuine importance to the starting point and would know and understand and comprehend the reasons for such. Whereas a feminazi would throw a temper tantrum and not ever think about anybody other than themselves. Because a feminazi doesn't actually ever think about anybody other than themselves because they only want to prop themselves up. Even other feminazis don't see that, and yet they acknowledge it for themselves and are too blind to pay attention to that fact. Where a feminist, genuinely true feminist, doesn't care. It's an equal opportunity where, yeah, here's these biases, however, here's this truth. This is what is, as far as what I've dealt with, this is what I've done, and whatever of capacity of, however, a feminist will actually acknowledge that, whereas a feminazi will try to cover it up. A feminazi doesn't ever like the truth, unless it fits them. A feminist knows that, yeah, the truth can hurt, but it's better to know the truth than to have a pretty lie, because that's all it is. So a feminist knows the ugliest of the ugly and can get just as ugly if needed. But a feminazi starts off being ugly. And so when they go further, they just become hideous. In comparison to a feminist, in truth, who can be hideous and ugly to other people, usually feminists that are ugly and hideous, are to feminazis. Whereas a feminist to another feminist can acknowledge something positive, something genuine, something worthwhile, and doesn't purposefully stir up needless problems. Doesn't ever want to slow anybody down either, because a feminazi would want to slow down anything and everything just because of that feminazi mentality. Because if it was genuinely, truthfully, where it was lifting other females up, a feminazi would stay out of the way of what's not their work. A feminazi would want to slow down progress because they would have an inner feeling of being left behind, because they wouldn't ever pay attention to the facts that a feminist knows how to actually progress, knows what it takes and the reasons why, because a feminist would pay attention to the fact that there are other females and males that would actually need that. So while a feminazi would want to try to cut that down, a feminist would know better. Because a feminazi would only pay attention to their little itty bitty circle, whereas a feminist would know there are far more females out there than just one little itty bitty circle. A feminist would pay attention to the fact that there are males who have daughters that actually care about their daughters, in comparison to a feminazi who would only care about one or two. A feminazi wouldn't actually ever have the proof where they themselves actually ever lifted someone who was different up without some sort of string attached. A feminist wouldn't ever look for a string unless there actually had to be the search for. Because a feminist knows that if they're going to be a feminist, well, they'll tie themselves up by their own corset straps, in comparison to a feminazi who would have to have that feeling and sensation of another person tying it up for them. Because a feminist knows how to tie their own bootstraps, which anybody who knows how corset strings are actual boot strings. Whereas a feminazi would need that explained to them. A feminist wouldn't care whether another female was a biological female or LGBTQP, because a feminist wouldn't pay attention to that, because all it would be as to humanity. Whereas a feminazi would want to check off certain little boxes in comparison. A feminist would acknowledge both the biological female and biological male factors while still acknowledging the LGBTQP, because realistically, everybody, once they're a biological adult, goes and explores something kinky at some point in time. Whereas a feminazi, well, it's only in this capacity. A feminazi wouldn't ever pay attention until it was pointed out by a feminist that they were around machismo-sexist individuals. And then the feminazi would try to actually defend that machismo-sexist mentality. Whereas a feminist would just point it out and then point out the fact that you would ever try to defend a sexist proves it all. Because a feminist wouldn't ever care about somebody else's opinions, especially someone who would think they knew better about the feminist than they knew themselves. Because only a sexist individual, because this is what it is, a feminazi is a female who is sexist against other females' progression. Just as equally sexist as a male machismo sexist. A feminazi, they don't see that. They are sexist against their own biological gender. They also don't see how being a feminazi or a sexist against their own biological gender translates into the LGBTQP community, unless it's pointed out. A feminist only acknowledges it after a certain point in time because why bother? Actions speak louder than words, and words only clarify actions. With intent. Whereas a feminazi will use words before, during, and after their choice of actions, a feminist may do the same in a limited capacity, because if they actually had to explain, well, 9 times out of 10 they don't want to, because they'd rather continue progressing forward and leading by example. Because why waste time unless there's an actual reason for a discussion in comparison to a lecture? Because a feminazi would prefer to have all that in comparison to actual progress, because the intellect would not be there for what an actual feminist is. A feminazi would pay more attention to words than they would ever pay attention to proof of action, until it was far later. Because a feminazi would purposefully cause needless problems to a feminist because of their own insecurities. Because internally, a feminazi knows that internally they are not progressive. Only a feminist actually is. A feminazi cannot progress without a feminist. However, a feminist can progress without a feminazi any day of the week. A feminist doesn't need a male or female to progress themselves, whereas a feminazi needs as many as possible, because they need that pat on the back every time, because that's that lack of internal strength. And then when a feminazi gets called out about that, they try to explain it some more. Whereas a feminist can just explain, make logical sense, and then continue proving with actions. A feminazi tries and does anything possible to bring an actual feminist down, because they don't have any worth or self-value in the actual capacities of. Because a feminazi doesn't ever think about anyone other than themselves and how to progress themselves forward in comparison. Because a feminazi doesn't ever actually think about anyone else. They are the most selfish individuals. Whereas a feminist can acknowledge the progression of themselves forward, but still pays attention to detail and assists where possible. Whereas a feminazi wants to be the definition of what President Ronald Reagan warned what the 4 scariest words are. Though, I guess since they both end with a T, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Though it's more than 4 words. Which I don't know if anybody ever picked up on that other than myself. Actually counted. And back in the 1980s, when President Ronald Reagan said that, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That's 8 words. That's an irony. Just a little, that's a little bit of an irony when you think about ding, 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 ding. Because if it was 4 words, wouldn't it be actually 4 words? Because technically it's either 8 or 9 words. Because I'm is technically a word, but it's a conjunctive word. So it's technically 2 words combined into one. So whether it's 8 or 9 words, I can make a joke in reference to my first group of publicated books, well, registered books through the Library of Congress. And since it's my life, they're my rights, always. Permanently. That's just the facts. It's nobody else's rights at all. So a feminazi would see something like that and want to involve themselves because they'd want to feel that they were doing something, but they do it in a slithering way. Whereas a feminist wouldn't ever hide, would just be truthful and out and to the point. Whereas a feminazi would want that special recognition. And yet, stirring up needless drama doesn't get that special recognition that same way. Because that's a stereotypical feminazi. And or associated with a sexist machismo male who wouldn't ever think about how sexist that actually would be. To ever think that doing things in a backwards way would ever be considered as supportive. Because someone who actually appreciates a feminist would be directly by the side of, proudly, without hesitation, honestly, without hiding, in truth, genuinely, and wouldn't belittle a feminist at any point in time. They would point out different factors to think about, but they wouldn't ever prohibit or impede the feminist's progress, because that's what a male or female feminist would do. A male feminazi would have problems with any female doing something they thought was male work. A male feminazi would actually align themselves with female feminazis. A male feminazi would be a sexist while also being a pervert. A male feminist would be respectful and have etiquette. A male feminist would know boundaries are important. A male feminist would not overstep boundaries that were set. A male feminist would ask with etiquette and respect. A male feminazi would only talk about the physical if there wasn't anything else that they could complain about. A male feminazi would go and compare females just to stir up drama, and a female feminazi would be too blind to see it. Whereas a female and male feminist would see it clearly and not want to have anything to do with. A male feminazi is just the same thing that has been for decades and centuries. A male feminist would be looked at as weak by male feminazis, whereas a male feminist would actually know their own internal strength to actually be capable and willing to push through in comparison to allowing themselves to be belittled by a group, whether male or female, feminazis. A male feminist would actually be proud of a female who earned on their own and would see the intrinsic value of that female feminist as well as male feminists. A male feminist wouldn't belittle a male feminazi except for pointing out the truth. A male feminist would have certain sensitivities regarding emotional factors, but would be capable to recognize that and would genuinely actually ponder and think in comparison to a male feminazi who would just complain about the gender and or the physical looks and or what they wished their feminazi cohort would be. Because the irony, a male feminazi seeing a genuine female feminist internally, secretly longs for one. But actually acknowledging that would translate to them having to acknowledge to their female feminazis that that's what they had wanted and wished for and hoped for all along. Because a male feminazi can see the value of a feminist, whereas a female feminist can't. A male feminazi will usually stir up a bunch of needless problems within the female feminazis, just because he can, while at the same time comparing the female feminist each and every time. Yet the female feminazi would only see it as a competition in comparison to the male feminist / feminazi. Because realistically, if a male feminazi is in a relationship with a female feminazi, there is some feminist traits and qualities, though they don't want to acknowledge it because of the saying, happy wife, happy life. And so a female feminazi would utilize that in the wrong ways each and every time. A female feminazi wouldn't ever pay attention until it was pointed out, and then they would try to backtrack and say, well, look at what I did here, and look at what I did there, and look how I helped here, and look at how I helped there, and I helped with this, and I helped with that, and the other feminazis around would call them out for the actual intentions of, because it would be known. Because an actual feminist equal opportunity one way or another. Not that there isn't loyalty, that's the furthest from the truth at that point. Because where a feminazi would require loyalty in only certain factors, a feminist would be loyal to humanity in comparison to just one or two sectors. And so feminazis that would want those little boxes checked, a feminist already checked each and every one of the boxes and then some that they didn't even know existed. So where, I've dealt with a few things. People don't know about the 1980s and 1990s when it comes to dealing with males and the sexism in the technological field. That's something only more recently, in the 2010s, I would guesstimate, would be when it was first figured out. In comparison, maybe a little earlier than the 2010s, but been around. I was born and raised in the 1980s and 1990s. And so I've seen my fair share of both feminists and feminazis in every gender, race, and creed. There's not a version of one or the other that I haven't met at some point in time, because the tri-state area truly is the melting pot. So I've met plenty of feminazis that are male. Oh, yeah, those machismo sexist ones. Met plenty of those. That's why when it came to scuba diving and earning my 26 scuba diving certifications, well, it's kind of like that Eminem song. This is why I could walk around like nothing's bothering me, even though half you people got a fucking problem with me. Additionally, in regards to what is supposed to be considered as the adult consenting lifestyle in comparison, well, another Eminem song. Here's my 10 cents, because 2 cents are free. Just saying, I have a thing for my Eminem. So it is true though. And so while feminazis are different than feminists, feminazis will only see those types of situations in a one-dimensional way until it's brought forward in the multifaceted aspects of. A feminist will automatically know and understand that it's multifaceted. They may not comprehend depending on who they are, but a feminist wouldn't ever turn that dial down. A feminist would put that on full blast in comparison to a feminazi. A feminazi wouldn't want it on full blast because it's so much. It doesn't fit this little box here, this little box there. A feminazi wouldn't ever see the larger picture unless it was pointed out to them, and by then, what level of had they involved themselves without permission to begin with. A feminazi wouldn't like seeing progress faster than they could move, because a feminazi would only want it in a certain capacity of, while they exploit others. Because that's what a feminazi does. A feminazi doesn't believe in discretion, in truth. A feminist knows, understands, and comprehends what discretion is for. A feminazi wouldn't think that there would ever be a need for discretion. A feminist would comprehend why. A feminazi would try and make attempts to force themselves into situations without an invitation. A feminist would look at invitations, make a decision for themselves, and do what would be best. A feminazi would see a feminist doing something that they weren't invited to, that would be progressive, and want in on it, even if they don't have any actualities themselves. A feminazi wouldn't ever pay attention to the reasons why feminists are different, unless they had a lecture. And even then, they would complain because they would try to convince themselves that they were actually feminists, and yet a feminazi would have to actually convince themselves, which would be the proof that they had been a feminazi the whole time. Whereas a feminist can just explain, give details of, and be capable to back it up. A feminazi would have to search and go and do all sorts of stuff that would be backwards to what a feminist is. A feminazi would have to declare by race, creed, gender, sexual preference, so on and so forth. A feminist wouldn't care, because it's still humanity. So when in reference to the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement and the LGBTQP rights movement, as well as what is considered as the sexual revolution in the combined multifaceted factor in the 1960s into the 1970s, well, how many realize certain factors regarding the American Civil War, conjunctive to the American Revolutionary War? Back then. Some may have, I'm sure, I wouldn't doubt it. I know my grandmama, my grandpapa, and their friends and their family brought up certain factors. I paid attention to that. So here's the difference between a feminist and a feminazi. A feminazi would take a look at the fact that I have a cousin Jade, and they wouldn't ever think as to certain factors, because they would assume to only pay attention to my skin tone. They wouldn't ever pay attention to anything else. And even if they paid attention to the Harlem and Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens and Manhattan factors, they wouldn't ever think outside that box. They'd think one-dimensional. And when pointed out, they would try to backtrack. They would try to explain otherwise. They would try, and realistically, actions and words at the exact same time would be automatic. I guarantee you, in this lecture, if you were to only listen to the words coming out of my mouth, you could tell who I spent a lot of time around when it comes to my grandmama, my grandpapa, as well as their friends and family. You would be capable to have an idea which churches I had been to in regards of the 5 boroughs in New York City in the 1980s and 1990s. You wouldn't need to actually see what I physically look as, though you may. but you would know just by the sound of my voice, as far as what I can speak, what I can preach, as to where I actually spent my time. And while, yes, I grew up in Marlborough Township, yes, I grew up going to Manalapan Township, and yes, I grew up going to Freehold Township, there are areas of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that would be capable to tell whose churches I have been to when it comes to extended family regarding my cousin Jade. As far as my grandmama and my grandpapa's family. So I grew up. And while, unlike some people who want to do what is the terminology of virtue signaling, for decades, I haven't really said much when it comes to, because personally, it didn't matter to me what my cousin Jade's father biologically had been and is regarding his ethnic background. I didn't care, not because I didn't care about the family overall, just because humanity. There wasn't anything in reference to any scientific factor in regards of. So while people in the South, people in the Midwest would hear grandmama and grandpapa, and well, that's something that is what it is. But when you take in consideration Harlem, New York City, the Bronx, New York City, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Camden, New Jersey, the Pines, New Jersey, Hoboken, New Jersey, Red Bank, New Jersey, Brooklyn, New York City, Queens, New York City, Manhattan, New York City, Newark, New Jersey. There are those who could recognize that as to who I actually spent time around. That would know, maybe not by full name or what have you, but would have that knowledge, understanding, and comprehension as to exactly who I was around. Because there are only so many churches from back then in the 1980s and 1990s. So those individuals would be capable to know and clarify. But unlike some people, such as feminazis, I wouldn't need to go and clarify and verify that for myself. Because the actions would speak just as loud as the words, each and every time. Whether the actions and or words were at the exact same time, or it was the actions first and then the words, or vice versa. Because of the truth. So then when you take in consideration, during the 1960s and 1970s, when it came to the civil rights movement, well, they didn't pay attention to their own in certain references regarding the LGBTQP. They didn't want to do certain things because sometimes it was just so much. There's so much going on, and which group here and which group there, and here, there, everywhere. And that is what it is. It was important because you had certain things, but it didn't change the facts when it came to that. And so now, in the year 2022, 30th of April, it's come full circle, all at the exact same time. And so, with the conglomerate of the additional factors, which was the last frontier, truthfully, before expansion, regarding space exploration in a larger capacity, you had to have that come together. Because if you didn't, how would you actually progress? Because while, yes, you can check these different boxes, you can pay attention to this here, there, and so on and so forth, if you don't pay attention to the whole, the entirety of, and I don't mean in reference to the seminary college situation. However, it is the reality as to those factors. So while some individuals might have thought in the DFW area regarding the Dominant Mentor Program that just because I woke up in the state of Texas, because I didn't graduate basic training in regards of, well, I explained how my head injury had occurred. I explained how that happened. So in the DFW area, in reference to supposed feminists, but realistically, let's be honest, on feminazis, because why would any female that would ever claim that they were a feminist, but realistically would be a feminazi, why would any female ever bring up the facts that I already knew as though it would be ever considered as an insult to me from someone who didn't even sign the dotted line themselves? How feminazi would that be for a bunch of females who didn't sign the dotted line to ever bring up that I didn't graduate basic training? However, I remained calm and I didn't bring up back then, well, you didn't even sign the dotted line. Because that's what a feminist would pay attention to. That wouldn't stir up needless drama. However, then there are the feminazis in the armed forces of the United States of America because they want to climb over one another in certain references. You have to work together, ladies, not against. So what in those references regarding whether active duty, National Guard, reservist, veteran, or dependent? Because why would any biological female ever bring that up in regards to me? Because how would you ever consider yourself a feminist when I'm giving credit where credit is due by acknowledging that I didn't graduate basic training in comparison to those types of feminazis that want to try? I've dealt with that before from 2000 to 2013. What you think you knew? No. I know there are those who yip on the side that did graduate basic training. And yet the exact points that I brought forward earlier in my lecture. Because what type of feminist would it be for somebody else to bring up that I didn't graduate basic training when I already acknowledged that myself? What you saying I don't know I didn't graduate basic training when I've said it myself? What type of feminazi would it be to have to point that out when I already acknowledged it? Unless you're a parent. Instead, if it's in a negative way. So in reference to the sexist males or the feminazi males who would ever, well, she didn't graduate basic training. Yeah, like I didn't know that. Oh wait, I did. Like I'm fairly certain most likely I brought it up before. So what level of sexism would that actually be? For a feminazi male to ever bring up something I already knew about myself, already acknowledged about myself. What level of sexism would that be from a male? As though I didn't know. I mean, I am the one who didn't graduate basic training, and you wouldn't have known unless I told you. See, unlike some individuals, I don't believe in stealing valor. So why would any, whether male or female biologically, why would anyone ever complain that I actually acknowledge that? Is it because it comes across as a negative in comparison to the positive that it is? Where it proves time and time and time again as to telling the actual truth, as to giving credit where credit is due, while acknowledging and not denying. So furthest from the truth. Because acknowledging that I didn't graduate basic training in the Army branch automatically gives credit where credit is due. Sure, I didn't graduate basic training because I had a head injury on Palm Sunday in 2000 because of one drill sergeant. Not the entire Army at the time. Whatever connections thereof, well, that's what's capable to be found, especially with technology. So any civilian factor that would ever interject themselves, especially those sexist, feminazi males that would ever have a problem with a strong, independent, feminist female, and yet would have the nerve to ever make a comment about a physical feature in any capacity unless it was an actual, genuine compliment with etiquette and respect. Because only a feminist male would know if you're going to compliment a female feminist, well, you know to do it with etiquette and respect. You don't have to be told that. Whereas a feminazi male would and then would complain. A feminazi male being told to have etiquette and respect would show their sexism. And they wouldn't even realize how that would actually fully show their own sexism as a feminazi male, because a feminazi male that would ever actually feel insulted as to being told what is considered etiquette and respect wouldn't ever see it unless it was pointed out. And then, when pointed out, they wouldn't like it. They would have a temper tantrum because how dare a feminist acknowledge their own internal thoughts? How dare a feminist actually, in a respectful way, clarify the difference as to etiquette and respect? Because a feminazi male wouldn't see how that would be a problem unless another male said would be exact to a female that feminazi male was with. Because a feminazi male would be too blind to even take that in consideration. A feminist male would be cautious, not only because of the feminazi types that would complain about any type of compliment. Because a feminazi female would complain to a feminist male if the compliment didn't fit their particular viewpoint. So a feminist male who would point out the intellect of a female, a feminazi male or female, would have a problem with a feminist male pointing out the intellectual capacities of a female. Wouldn't even matter if it was a feminazi or a feminist female, as to the irony of the sexist machismo feminazi male. Though the feminazi females would be just as vicious, because how dare you actually pay attention to the intellectual capabilities of a female. A feminazi female and feminazi male would pay more attention to the physical of a feminist female any day of the week, because the feminazi female would have whatever issues of their own internally of their own physical look. Whereas a feminazi male would have an issue with the way a feminist female would look, because they'd have to look at them. Whereas a feminist male would see modesty where there was modesty. A feminist male would see sexuality if it was brought forward, but would be cautious. A feminist male would not judge a feminist female for accepting herself, whereas a feminazi male and a feminazi female off the bat, without paying attention to their own background, as far as their own numbers, would be like that. A feminist male and a feminist female wouldn't care, but if it had to be brought forward, would still be capable to clarify and back it up. And even if they had differing viewpoints, whatever the aspects of, a feminist male would not blame a feminist female for her opinions. A feminist male would actually seek to speak with the feminist female, to actually discuss in etiquette and respect, whereas a feminazi male would just complain. A feminazi male that had boundaries set would throw a fit, especially if a feminist female set those boundaries. Because a feminazi male wouldn't ever think on their own of how to, with etiquette and respect, contact a feminist female. They would only want to do it their way, in comparison to ever taking in consideration what the feminist female would prefer. A feminazi male and a feminazi female would complain if a feminist actually stood her ground. A feminazi male and a feminazi female would have problems and then overstep those boundaries, not ever paying attention to the hypocrisy as to that, because they would seek that for themselves and yet wouldn't ever think twice. Because if they did, that would mean they'd actually have to think about their actions and choices in a larger capacity of not just at that second, but from the past to the present to the future. Because a feminazi, in whichever capacity of, wouldn't even think about the past or the future, except for the current time frame and the shortest time to the future, whereas a feminist would look at the past, the present, and the future to the longest term possible. A feminazi would have a problem with the feminist who would actually see that far and see the reasons, where a feminist would recognize that. So what is the difference between a feminazi and a feminist? Well, you can evaluate for yourself from this lecture. Do make sure, if you're going to leave a comment, please do, as far as my official YouTube video, with etiquette and respect. Subscribe to my official YouTube channel and share the link to my official YouTube videos. You know, mine. And go to my website, www.susanmealing.com. Remember, today is the 30th of April, 2022. Though I have brought up the dates time and time again, you know, clarifying and verifying in truth. Because, you know, as a feminist, I've paid attention to time. A feminazi doesn't realize that time has always been involved. You have a good day.